On March 12, 1981, at exactly 8:47 p.m., Washington, D.C. was settling into another quiet evening. Streetlights flickered on across the Capitol, office windows dimmed one by one, and the machinery of the Cold War hummed beneath the surface like an engine no one could see, but everyone could feel. It was on this night that a man named Richard Coleman, 44 years old, walked into the J. Edgar Hoover building carrying a simple brown briefcase. What he carried inside was not a weapon, nor a threat, nor a resignation letter. It was something far more devastating, a collection of documents and photographs that would unravel his marriage, shatter his children's innocence, and expose one of the most unexpected espionage cases of the early Reagan era. Inside the briefcase were photographs of classified Commerce Department documents, coded letters written in Russian, and a list of names written in his wife Margaret's unmistakable handwriting. By the time he exited the building 3 hours later, a quiet suburban family from Arlington, Virginia, had been thrust into the center of a geopolitical storm, one that would leave scars lasting decades. Arlington in 1981 was the portrait of American normalcy. Tree-lined streets, two-story colonials, children playing until the streetlights came on, and neighbors who knew each other's names. To the outside world, the Colemans were exactly that kind of family. Richard, a mid-level analyst at the Department of Commerce since 1973, spent his days buried in trade reports, export data, and policy assessments, mundane to some, but sensitive in the Cold War environment, where even small economic insights could shape global strategies. Margaret, his wife, also worked at the Commerce Department as an administrative assistant in the Office of Trade Policy. 3 days a week, she handled filing, routing documents, and coordinating office communications. On her off days, she turned the family living room into a piano studio, teaching neighborhood children scales and sonatas, while her own kids, Jennifer, 13, Michael, 11, and Sarah, 8, were at school. In every visible way, they were the quintessential American family balancing careers, schedules, and suburban life. But the Cold War had a way of creeping into ordinary homes in ways no one expected. It was an era defined by paranoia and silence, an era where the line between loyalty and betrayal often blurred. Intelligence agencies on both sides were desperate not only for military secrets, but for economic insight, trade flow predictions, shipping analyses, resource assessments, all tools the superpowers used to anticipate each other's moves. And it was often within civilian bureaucracies, not military vaults, where those cracks could be exploited. For the Colemans, the first crack appeared on January 28, 1981, when Richard returned home from work early with flu-like symptoms. He later described Margaret's reaction as oddly startled, her face flushed, movements too quick, too rehearsed. He dismissed it at first. Couples chalk up strange behavior to stress, or bad days, or misunderstandings. But the next morning, fate led him to a detail he could no longer ignore. In the back of their bedroom closet, a loose floorboard he'd been meaning to fix for months was sticking up more than usual. When he pried it open, he found a small metal box. Its contents were enough to stop his breath. Inside were 23 photographs of documents, grain export reports, trade analyses, interoffice memos. Some he recognized as his own work. Others were from departments Margaret would have had access to. There were 4 coded Russian letters containing instructions about dead drops and communication protocols, receipts from a Georgetown photo shop, and a notebook filled with columns of numbers that cryptographers would later identify as a substitution cipher. Richard's world tilted. In the Cold War, Americans were trained to imagine spies as distant figures, foreign agents living glamorous double lives, not piano teachers from Arlington. But intelligence history proves the opposite. The CIA, the KGB, MI6, every agency learned that the most effective spies were often the ones who appeared the most ordinary. Richard did not confront Margaret. Instead, he did something colder, more methodical, something that showed he already suspected that the truth, once uncovered, would destroy everything. For the next 6 weeks, he conducted his own private surveillance operation. He photographed every item in the box using his Canon AE-1. He developed the film in a different city, under a false name, paying cash. He checked the compartment on a strict schedule, documenting every change. On February 7th, 3 new photographs appeared, fresh documents, including one report he had brought home himself. On February 19th, new coded entries filled 2 pages of the notebook. On March 2nd, one of the original letters disappeared and was replaced by a new one written in different handwriting. This wasn't accidental. This was an active intelligence operation. Someone inside Richard's home had a handler, a schedule, and a mission. And if Margaret was the asset, then Arlington was no longer just a suburb. It was a battlefield. By mid-February, Richard's surveillance expanded outdoors. Margaret's Tuesday and Thursday evening errands became predictable, always between 7:15 and 8:45 p.m., always ending at the same park 4 miles away. Richard followed her. She would sit on the same bench each time, placing her purse on the left side, always the left side, as if marking a position. And then came February 26th, the night Richard saw it happen. A man approached the bench before Margaret arrived. He sat briefly, read a newspaper, then left it behind. 10 minutes later, a jogger picked up the paper and ran. It was textbook tradecraft, a dead drop in plain sight. For an analyst trained in security protocols, Richard understood the gravity immediately. Cold War intelligence techniques were designed to be quiet, undetectable, and devastatingly effective. Dead drops like this had moved microfilms, encrypted notes, and sometimes entire strategies between Moscow and its U.S. assets. His wife wasn't dabbling. She was embedded. The night he found the canvas bag in the basement, a second ID for Margaret under the name Elaine Warner, a road map with marked locations, $500 in cash, and a calendar matching her dead drop visits. Any lingering hope evaporated. Margaret Coleman was a spy, and Richard Coleman was living inside a Cold War nightmare. He sat awake in the dark that night, processing not just the betrayal of his country, but the betrayal of their marriage. What if everything, their first date, their wedding, their shared routines, had been a stage set for espionage? Or was she recruited later, trapped by threats he couldn't imagine? In the Cold War, the truth was often more complicated than ideology. People weren't always driven by hatred of their country. Sometimes it was manipulation, sometimes fear, sometimes desperation. And sometimes it began with something as harmless as trust in the wrong person. By March 10th, Richard had enough evidence to bring down not just Margaret, but an entire Soviet intelligence node. But he was haunted by a single question: how to save his children from the fallout. He spent hours alone in his car, calculating consequences the way an analyst studies risk maps. If he reported her, the public scandal would consume his children's lives. If he didn't, he became complicit. There was no outcome that preserved both loyalty to his country and safety for his family. So Richard made the most devastating choice of his life. He would report his wife and construct a lie so enormous it would protect his children from the truth. On March 11th, 1981, the night before he planned to walk into the FBI, Richard moved through his day like a man trapped inside a dream, aware of what was coming, helpless to alter its course. At the Commerce Department, he sat at his desk pretending to review export projections for Eastern Europe, but the numbers on the page blurred into meaninglessness. Every instinct told him he was walking toward an irreversible collision with the United States government, the Soviet intelligence apparatus, and the fragile world of 3 children who had no idea their lives were about to rupture. That night, the Coleman family shared their final normal dinner: spaghetti, garlic bread, salad, the kind of simple meal that represented routine, stability, and the illusion of safety. Jennifer talked about a school exam. Michael showed off a potato-powered light bulb experiment he'd built. Sarah asked about a sleepover. Margaret smiled, laughed, touched Richard's hand, and he looked at her, knowing she had absolutely no idea that in less than 24 hours, federal agents would be reading her coded letters in an evidence room. The Cold War had created thousands of these moments, families unaware that their lives were intertwined with global espionage. History often paints spies as loners, masterminds, villains. Yet intelligence archives tell a different story. The most devastating infiltrations often came from ordinary households, particularly those with access to bureaucratic layers of government. In espionage, familiarity was an asset. Normalcy was camouflage. And Margaret, whether by coercion or conviction, had mastered that camouflage. When Richard walked into the FBI's J. Edgar Hoover building on the evening of March 12th, he carried not only a briefcase full of evidence, but the weight of 16 years of marriage. Special Agent David Thornton, who later wrote the declassified memo summarizing the meeting, described Richard as calm, calculated, but emotionally exhausted. For 3 hours, he laid out his secret investigation: photographs, logs, timestamps, locations, coded entries, dead drop observations, and every piece of documentation necessary to dismantle a Soviet asset within the Commerce Department. Thornton's report made one thing clear: Richard may not have been a trained intelligence officer, but his private investigation rivaled professional counterintelligence work. And the FBI immediately saw what this meant: not just that Margaret was a spy, but that she had penetrated an agency already concerned about leaks. For months, U.S. analysts had struggled to explain why Soviet trade forecasts seemed to anticipate American policy shifts. Now the puzzle pieces aligned. Someone inside commerce was feeding Moscow real-time intelligence. But what stunned the agents was not only the scale of Margaret's activities, it was Richard's request. He wanted the FBI to help him lie. He wanted the children to be told that their mother had cancer, that she needed to go to a specialized treatment facility, and that the government should facilitate this fiction. He wanted the arrest to be discreet. No media, no public documents, no handcuffs in front of the children. He wanted Margaret's removal from their lives to appear as a medical tragedy, not an act of treason. Agents debated the request intensely. Federal procedure did not include manufacturing cover stories for the families of suspects. Yet the logic was compelling. A public arrest could compromise other investigations, alert Soviet handlers, and destroy 3 young lives. In the end, for reasons equal parts strategic and compassionate, the FBI approved Richard's plan. 2 days later, on March 14, 1981, Margaret Coleman was arrested at 6:47 a.m. in her kitchen while making coffee. She did not resist. She did not ask for an attorney. According to the arresting agents, she looked at Richard and quietly said, "You found it." That small admission carried the weight of an entire secret life. Upstairs, the children were asleep. By noon, Richard gathered them in the living room and delivered the script he had rehearsed 100 times. Their mother was sick. Very sick. She needed treatment far away. They wouldn't be able to visit for now. He showed them medical pamphlets he'd checked out from the library, explaining procedures he didn't fully understand, but had memorized well enough to sound believable. The children accepted the story. Why would they doubt it? This was their father, a man steady, predictable, logical, who had never lied to them before. Meanwhile, Margaret, now a federal prisoner, was aware of the story Richard was telling their children. During her supervised visit on March 16th, she embraced them, spoke words of comfort, and played her role in the lie with heartbreaking sincerity. For 30 minutes, she acted not as a Soviet spy nor a federal defendant, but simply as a mother trying to soften the world for her children. It was the last time they saw her for 14 years. What unfolded next was a case study in Cold War intelligence operations, a convergence of personal tragedy and geopolitical strategy. In federal court, proceedings were held under the Classified Information Procedures Act, limiting public access. Margaret cooperated with investigators, admitted to her recruitment by Elena Rostova, a woman posing as a piano teacher but operating under diplomatic cover. Her testimony revealed the uncomfortable truth about espionage recruitment. It rarely starts with ideology. It starts with friendship, subtle pressure, psychological manipulation, and eventually, fear. By 1977, she was taking photographs of classified documents 2 to 3 times a month. Intelligence analysts later determined that some of her information likely influenced Soviet economic forecasting models, affecting grain negotiations and trade responses. It was espionage not of rockets and warheads, but of economics, another battlefield of the Cold War. Margaret pleaded guilty to conspiracy, unauthorized possession, and transmission of national defense information, and acting as an unregistered agent of a foreign government. She received a 25-year sentence. Within a week, Richard began the second life of his deception, preserving the illusion that Margaret was alive, in treatment, and possibly returning one day. In Arlington, neighbors expressed sympathy. Teachers offered extensions for assignments, and the community embraced the Coleman children with kindness. No one suspected that the truth was unfolding in sealed federal courtrooms miles away. Jennifer threw herself into academics. Michael became obsessed with disassembling and rebuilding electronics, perhaps a subconscious attempt to understand systems, broken or hidden, that he couldn't control. Sarah grew quiet, introspective, absorbing grief she didn't yet understand. Meanwhile, Richard maintained the illusion meticulously. Letters from Margaret arrived monthly, with institutional postmarks he hid from the children. He kept her piano exactly where it had always been. He spoke of her in the present tense. He convinced himself that he was preserving his family, never acknowledging that each passing month made the truth more radioactive. But lies have half-lives. And this one, forged under the pressure of national security and parental fear, was decaying faster than Richard realized. In 1987, the lie unraveled. Jennifer, now a college freshman majoring in biology, realized the timeline of her mother's illness made no medical sense. 6 years of treatment, with no remission, no decline, no updates. It defied everything she had learned. Her call to Richard on April 22, 1987, ended the fabricated world he had built. She asked, with the clarity of someone who has solved a puzzle they never wanted to solve, "When did Mom actually die?" Richard could no longer run. He told her the truth, the espionage, the arrest, the prison, the lie. Jennifer fell silent. Then she hung up. The fallout was only beginning. The moment Richard confessed the truth to Jennifer in 1987, a fault line ripped through the Coleman family, one far deeper than anything caused by Margaret's espionage. Espionage had removed a mother from her children's lives, but the lie had removed their ability to trust the one parent they had left. What unfolded next became, in the language of family therapists, a cascade fracture. Once one child learned the truth, the entire structure of deception collapsed. Jennifer told no one for 3 days. She skipped classes, sat alone in the university arboretum, and tried to reconcile the mother she remembered with the secret life described over the phone. She replayed the last visit in 1981, the fluorescent lights, the sterile room, her mother's trembling hands, and realized that she had not been visiting a hospital. She had been visiting a federal holding facility. The betrayal, in her mind, was not Margaret's espionage. It was the lie that had transformed her entire childhood into fiction. Finally, unable to carry the weight alone, Jennifer called Michael. Michael was 17, logical, sharp, and already predisposed to skepticism. When Jennifer recounted the truth, his reaction was not shock, it was fury. Cold, controlled fury. He demanded documentation, dates, arrest reports, court filings. He wanted to understand every detail. As if reconstructing the sequence of events could give him back the years he had lost. 3 days later, the siblings sat Sarah, just 14, on the living room couch and told her everything. Sarah listened quietly, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. She asked almost no questions. She simply shut down, retreating behind a wall so complete that even therapists later struggled to reach her. She began speaking to Richard only when absolutely necessary. Short, flat responses, the bare minimum for functional living. Meanwhile, neighbors noticed tension in the Coleman home. Richard and Michael's shouting matches could be heard through thin Arlington walls. Jennifer visited less frequently, and when she did, her conversations with her father were stiff and distant. Sarah's teachers noted behavioral changes, withdrawal, distractedness, emotional numbness. The facade of stability Richard had maintained for 6 years disintegrated almost overnight. What followed in the next year was not simply a family crisis. It was the psychological aftermath of Cold War intelligence operations, an example of how espionage ripples far beyond classified documents and government ledgers. In counterintelligence history, there are dozens of cases where families suffered collateral trauma, but few were as thoroughly documented as the Coleman case became. Family therapist Dr. Patricia Morrison, brought in during 1988, later described the Colemans as a live demonstration of trust dissolution. They were individuals who had grown up inside a narrative engineered for protection, only to discover that protection had been built on deception. Jennifer, the oldest, adopted an intellectual approach to coping. She dove into public policy coursework, perhaps subconsciously drawn to systems she could analyze and predict, unlike the chaos her father had unleashed. She visited home less frequently, maintaining polite but rigid boundaries with Richard. Michael, in contrast, weaponized logic. He interrogated Richard for hours about the sequence of events, demanding clarity that no explanation could truly satisfy. He asked why Richard hadn't trusted them, why he assumed they would be destroyed by the truth instead of strengthened by it. In his mind, the lie wasn't a kindness. It was a vote of no confidence in his children's resilience. Eventually, exhausted by circular arguments, Michael cut off communication for nearly a year. Sarah, the youngest, bore the heaviest psychological burden. She had no memory stable enough to withstand the shock of the truth. Her mother was not dead, not dying of cancer, not lost to medical tragedy. She was alive in a prison hundreds of miles away, serving a sentence for betraying the nation. Sarah experienced what Morrison termed identity voiding, a state wherein the foundational relationships of childhood are revealed as illusions. She cried for hours the night she learned the truth, and spoke to Richard through clenched teeth for months afterward. Richard was forced to face what he had spent years refusing to acknowledge. The lie meant to protect his children had become the most destructive act of his life. Yet in interviews years later, Richard remained convinced that he had done the right thing. He believed that the stigma of espionage would have broken his children's spirits in 1981, that growing up as the kids of a Soviet spy would have marked them permanently in a Cold War-era community that viewed treason as a near unforgivable sin. Perhaps he was right. Perhaps he underestimated them. That tension between protection and damage became the moral gray zone that defined the Coleman tragedy. The turning point arrived in 1995, after nearly a decade of emotional distance and painful reconstruction. Jennifer, Michael, and Sarah, now adults, made the decision to visit Margaret in federal prison. For 14 years, they had lived with two radically different versions of their mother. The loving parent they remembered, and the covert operative described in court transcripts. They needed clarity, closure, answers. Margaret was 62 when they saw her again. Prison time had aged her, lines etched deep into her face, gray streaks throughout her hair, but her eyes were unmistakably the same. The visitation room was cold, metallic, unmistakably institutional. Folding chairs, concrete floors, humming fluorescent lights. The siblings sat across from the woman who had shaped their early lives and shattered them in equal measure. What happened in those 4 hours would later define the emotional arc of the Coleman story. Margaret spoke not like a spy defending her actions, but like a woman who had carried guilt for 14 years. She told them about Elena Rostova, the Soviet intelligence officer who had infiltrated her life through gentle friendship. She explained the early assignments, innocent at first, framed as harmless exchanges between colleagues interested in diplomacy. She described the gradual escalation, the pressure, the veiled threats against her family. She admitted the fear, the rationalizations, the night spent convincing herself she was doing something meaningful before the truth crushed her. She did not excuse herself. She did not demand forgiveness. She simply told the truth, something none of them had heard from a parent in nearly 2 decades. In the years that followed, the children visited her regularly, not out of obligation, but out of a desire to understand, to rebuild, to reclaim control of a narrative that had been written for them by history, geopolitics, and their father's desperate choices. Jennifer came from Washington, D.C., where she was building a career in public policy. Michael drove up from North Carolina, where he worked as an engineer. Sarah visited during breaks from her graduate psychology program, gravitating toward a field shaped by her own complicated childhood. Each visit stitched together a fragile but genuine relationship with their mother, one limited by plexiglass windows and strict visitation schedules, but real nonetheless. One person, however, never visited Margaret. Richard. He received her letters, nearly 200 of them, but never once replied. He kept them locked in a drawer, preserved like artifacts of a past he could not rewrite. In interviews, Richard said he had no anger toward Margaret, no lingering resentment. He simply believed that once he made the decision in 1981, their paths had diverged forever. He had saved his children, he believed. And that belief, regardless of its truth, became the anchor he clung to. But history is not kind to simple narratives. The Coleman case became iconic precisely because it defied easy classification. Was Richard a protector or a betrayer? Was Margaret a villain or a victim of psychological manipulation? Were the children spared or permanently transformed? In the Cold War, the truth was rarely binary, and as the Coleman family moved toward their final chapter, the consequences of two lives, one built on espionage, the other on deception, were about to collide once more. Margaret Coleman walked out of federal prison on November 8, 2006, a free woman at last. She was 63 years old, carrying 2 plastic bags of personal belongings and the weight of 22 years lost to the Cold War. Her release, reduced for good behavior and cooperation with counterintelligence debriefings, marked the end of one of the least known yet most psychologically complex espionage cases in American history. Unlike the famous spies of the era, Ames, Hansen, Walker, Margaret left prison not to media attention, but to silence. There were no reporters, no cameras, no headlines. Her story had been buried beneath decades of classified files, sealed hearings, and the quiet suffering of a family torn apart. She settled in a small apartment in Atlanta and found work in a local music store, stocking shelves and tuning instruments for customers who would never know her past. A quiet existence, a second chance, a life rebuilt from fragments. 4 years later, on June 15, 2010, Richard Coleman collapsed in his garden from a heart attack. He was 73. His death was sudden, swift, and tunnel, without the long confessions or reconciliations that often accompany the ending chapters of complicated lives. When Jennifer, Michael, and Sarah returned to Arlington to sort through their father's belongings, they discovered a locked drawer in his study. Inside it were roughly 200 letters from Margaret, letters she had written from prison over 2 decades. Letters Richard had never shown them. Letters he never answered. The siblings sat in their childhood home, reading page after page, reflections, apologies, memories, updates about her prison job, thoughts about the children she could not see, remorse for choices she could not undo. Some letters included music notes. Others enclosed dried flowers pressed between pages. All of them revealed a woman trying to maintain a connection across barriers of steel bars and emotional distance. The discovery raised a haunting question that would follow the Coleman children for years. Had Richard preserved the letters out of guilt or out of love? Because the truth was complicated. Richard had both protected and wounded them. He had shielded them from public shame, but had denied them years with their mother. He had dismantled a Soviet espionage operation, but had constructed a family lie too heavy for anyone to carry. He had acted with integrity toward his country, but with deception toward his children. The Cold War was full of paradoxes, but few were as deeply personal as the Coleman case. Jennifer, reading through a letter dated 1988, broke down. It described how Margaret still imagined the sound of her children playing piano in the living room, a memory Margaret repeated again in letters from 1991, 1994, 1999. Longing captured in ink that had yellowed with time. Michael found a letter addressed to Richard from 1997 in which Margaret wrote, "Whatever judgments history makes about me, I hope none of them erase the truth that I was a mother who loved her children." The last line of that letter shook him. Please tell them something real about me someday. But Richard never did. Sarah, the psychologist of the family, understood something her siblings had not yet voiced. Every decision her parents made, in espionage, in deception, in silence, was rooted not in malice, but in fear. Margaret feared what her Soviet handlers might do if she refused to cooperate. Richard feared what the world might do to his children if he told them the truth. Fear, she realized, is the quiet architect of many tragedies. The Coleman case stands as a microcosm of a larger geopolitical reality. During the Cold War, intelligence battles were not fought only in war rooms and embassies. They were fought in kitchens, living rooms, and closets hidden beneath loose floorboards. They infiltrated marriages, ruptured identities, and reshaped families. The enemy was not always a foreign agent. It was secrecy itself. Margaret was never quoted in public. No memoir, no interview, no testimony after her release. She lived her final years outside the spotlight, perhaps understanding that nothing she said could truly rewrite the past. But the archived court transcripts, declassified FBI memos, and the children's own recollections create a profile consistent with many Cold War recruits. She was not trained for espionage. She was groomed for it. Recruitment during the 1970s often exploited social vulnerabilities, loneliness, a desire for validation, the illusion of friendship. Soviet handlers were skilled psychologists long before the term became fashionable. And Margaret, by her own admission, believed at first that she was contributing to diplomacy, not treason. By the time she understood the stakes, the consequences had become too dangerous to escape. Experts in intelligence history often note that Margaret's case reflects a common but uncomfortable truth. Espionage is rarely about ideology. It is about manipulation, pressure, coercion, and survival. But Richard's story complicates the narrative further. Because his actions, turning in his wife, lying to his children, refusing contact with Margaret even after her release, raise questions not about espionage, but about morality. Was he right? Did he go too far? Was there ever a version of events where the outcome was anything but tragic? Some analysts argue that Richard's lie was an act of mercy, shielding young children from a stigma they could not comprehend. Others argue that the lie robbed them of agency, creating years of compounded grief far worse than the truth. In one of her final therapy notes, Dr. Morrison wrote, "Both parents acted out of fear, and both believed they were protecting their family. In reality, they were protecting themselves from the consequences of the truth. This is perhaps the most devastating insight of all. Espionage did not destroy the Coleman family. Silence did." Over the next decade, Jennifer, Michael, and Sarah maintained an intermittent relationship with their mother as adults. They visited her small Atlanta apartment on holidays, exchanged letters and phone calls, and tried, slowly, painfully, to build a connection from the shards of a lost childhood. Their relationship was not quite forgiveness, not quite reconciliation, but something human and fragile and real. Margaret never remarried. She spent her days working among pianos, an echo of the life she once had, and weekends volunteering at a community center teaching music to children. The irony was not lost on her. She had once conducted secret intelligence exchanges in parks. Now she taught chords and scales to teenagers trying to stay out of trouble. The Cold War ended. The Soviet Union collapsed. Trade policy shifted. The world moved on. But the consequences of espionage linger in human timelines far longer than political ones. Richard died, believing he had done the right thing. Margaret died in 2017, quietly, with no obituary connecting her to the case that had defined her life. The 3 Coleman children, now adults with families of their own, still carry the imprint of those 6 lost years, and the truth revealed too late. The story of Richard and Margaret Coleman endures not because it is sensational, but because it exposes a rare intersection of geopolitics and family psychology. It is a reminder that the Cold War was not only fought by governments, it was fought inside households, marriages, and the minds of people caught between loyalty and fear. Richard betrayed his wife to save his country. Margaret betrayed her country to protect her family, and in the end, both lost the very things they were trying to defend. Espionage fractures nations. Lies fracture families. And sometimes, the deepest wounds are the ones history never records.